Now we're going to have a look at iterative structures. So we've seen conditional structures in the past video, which is our if statements. Now we're looking at loops, iterative structures, and repetition. In Python, there's two different types of loops. We have for loops and we have while loops. And just like with our if statements, the only way of defining what's part of the loop and what isn't is the indentation that we use. So we're going to start with a while loop because that's what we're going to need for our guessing game. And this is the general structure of our while loop. We start with the word while, and then we have another condition, just like we'd have with our if statement. But now, as long as that condition is true, everything that is indented underneath that statement will repeat. So we'll execute these lines one after another, go back to the top, check if that condition is still true. If it is, we keep going through. If it's not, we'd go down to the next line that's not indented. Note also that just like the if statement, it has a colon at the end of that first line. Now, if you had a line a couple of lines down, or at any point after that while loop is initiated, it will end at that point. So in this case, it would only execute these two lines of code and then go back to the condition is true. And if it still remains true, it'll go back through those first two lines. But it won't go through these instructions until that loop at the top is complete. So now if we try and apply that concept, we can see I've got a while loop here, and I've created a variable called x. And I want to say while that's less than 10, I want to print the value that's stored in that variable. And then we're going to increase that value by 1. Then after that we go back up to the top and repeat that process. So it should print out the numbers up until 10. But you'll see if I run this program now, we've got a problem. It says the name x is not defined, but that seems a bit strange because we've got it here a number of times. But what it means is when we first do this comparison, while x is less than 10, at that point we haven't given x a value. There's actually no starting value. So for this type of loop, it's really important that before we start it, we define x. So let's start x at 0. Now if we run that program, you'll see it prints out the numbers 0 through to 9. Now why does it stop at 9 and not go to 10? Well, as we go through, the value of x increases, and let's say it gets up to 9 at this point. When you go back here, 9 is less than 10, so you still execute this line, which will print it out. Then 9 plus 1 gives you 10. You go back up here, 10 is not less than 10, it's the same. If you had less than or equal to, it would print it out, but we don't. So then you would go to the next line after here, which we don't have, but let's say we could say print end, just to check that that's all working. So we'll run that one more time, and we get down to end. If I change that to less than or equal to, run it again, it should print up to 10 this time, and then have end as our last line. One thing you need to be really aware of when you're doing this type of loop is that you must include something that changes the value that is part of that initial condition. If we forgot this line, which is really easy to do, and people forget it all of the time, every time we go through that loop, the value of x isn't changing. So that means we're going to do this forever, which is what we call an infinite loop, because it will just repeat without end, because that value of x never changes, and it will never get above 10. This can crash your program, it can crash your computer, cause you all sorts of problems, so make sure you do include that line of code so that it will increment or increase the value of x as you go through your loop. Remember, we can also use shorthand for this because we're increasing the value of x itself. We could just have x plus equals 1, and that will do the same thing. Right, so your challenge now is to implement that while loop that we've just learnt to your guessing game, so that it will repeat. It will keep asking the user to guess until they get it right. Now it's a little bit tricky to think of that condition you're going to need at the start, but I've got a hint for you here. You're probably going to want to use this not equal comparison operator. Okay, so have a go at that, then come back to this video and we'll see what I've got in my version. Right, so back in my code here, I've made some changes. The most important thing is I've added this line here. And I'm saying while the guess is not equal to the target. So as long as the guess isn't the same as the target, it means we need to keep guessing. We need to keep trying until we get it right. Then on the next line, I've got my guess and see how it's indented to make sure it's part of that while loop, just like everything here is. And then you can also see we've got two levels of indentation now because we've got an if statement inside a while loop. So we want all of this code to be part of that loop, and this statement here on this line is only executed if this condition is true. Okay, so we're going to ask for the guess on the first part of our while loop. They enter their guess, and then we go through the if statements that we had just like before to check if they got it right or if it's too high or too low. Then when we get down to the bottom of this, we go back up to this first line and we check if guess is equal to target. If it is, that means we can go down to the bottom here, and we don't have any code, but we will just put in our print end to test it, and that will only be printed once this whole loop is complete, which only happens when that is false. Now let's try and run this program. We can enter our name, that's fine, and then we have a problem. Okay, we have another error saying the name guess is not defined. Now if you'd been looking closely before I ran that program you would have seen this little X on the left here to say that we have another problem. Guess is used before assignment. So similar to the error we had before with X, we need to actually give guess a value before we go through here. Now we could just move this line of code up and out of that loop, but then we won't have it in the loop itself, and we need to ask them to guess again every time. So what I'm going to do is just set the value for guess to -1, because we know that can't be correct because our range here is from 0 to 100. So if we set it to -1, it means the first time we go through this loop, it's always going to go through because this condition will be true. The guess is not equal to the target. So now if I try and run that again, so my target's 47. Let's say I put in 34. It's too low. Let's try 50. Too high. Let's try 47. You got it right, and we've got our end printed out as well. So that's all working correctly, and we have tested it appropriately as well on some basic input. Okay, so if you didn't manage to get your program working before, make sure you have a look at this code carefully and get yours up and running. There's lots in this program now. We're starting to get a lot of the key programming concepts involved, and we've got just a few more things to go to finish off this program.